I was standing behind the heavy wooden doors of Old Point Chapel, straightening the cuffs on my dress whites for the 10th time, when my phone buzzed. I shouldn't have looked, but habit won. The message was a single, stark word: disgraceful. No good luck, no I'm proud of you. Just that. I stared at the screen for a second, reading it twice to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Nope. Same tone she'd used my entire career whenever the uniform came up. No exclamation marks, no extra words. She never wasted energy on the stuff that might actually land soft. Behind me, two of my oldest teammates, both long retired, both carrying a little extra weight and a lot of history, stood at parade rest. Chief Raul Vega glanced at me, saw the phone in my hand, and raised an eyebrow like he already knew. He'd been around long enough to understand family drama doesn't stop for rank. To my right, Senior Chief Neil Porter adjusted the single prosthetic leg that stuck out from his neatly pressed trousers. The man could run laps around most 20-year-olds, but you could tell he hated standing still. Both of them had insisted on walking me into the chapel. I told them they didn't have to. They told me it wasn't up for discussion. Outside the door, I could hear the shuffle of dress shoes, the soft clearing of throats, and the occasional clink of metals. I'd been in plenty of ceremonies, promotions, retirements, memorials, but this was the first one where I was the reason for all the chairs, the flowers, and the photographer waiting at the back. Julian was already up front. He wasn't military, but he'd been around enough briefings to know how to stand like he belonged. The plan was simple. No bridesmaids, no groomsmen, no rehearsed readings. Just us, a Navy chaplain, and whoever decided to show up. Apparently, whoever now included a crowd big enough to fill the chapel to capacity. I'd been told a handful of old SEAL candidates I'd trained might come. I hadn't been told there were 200 people crammed in there. You could feel the weight of it through the door. I slipped the phone into my pocket and took a slow breath. My heart rate wasn't spiking. It was steady, like before a big inspection. Vega leaned in. "You ready, Admiral?" "Always," I said, even though part of me wasn't thinking about the man I was about to marry. I was thinking about the woman who'd just sent that text and whether she was even on base. Mom had been in the Army longer than I'd been alive. Retired Colonel Diane McKenna, sharp, no nonsense, allergic to anything she considered ceremonial fluff. She raised me on discipline, early mornings, and the belief that safety came from avoiding unnecessary risks. Serving in the Navy didn't qualify as safe in her book. It wasn't even in the same library. We hadn't spoken much in the past 2 years. When I sent her the wedding invitation, I kept it short. Saturday, 1,300 hours. Old Point Chapel. I'll be in uniform. I wasn't expecting a speech in return. I also wasn't expecting disgraceful. Porter shifted his weight and gave me the kind of nod you give a teammate before you kick down a door. "It's time," he said. The chapel doors were thick, old, and heavy, the kind you could lean your whole body into without moving an inch. On the other side, I could hear the faint murmur of 100 conversations blending together, then dropping as someone must have noticed the chaplain moving into position. One of the ushers, a young petty officer I barely knew, stepped up, gave a quick glance at the medals on my chest, and straightened his posture like I was about to inspect him. He whispered, "We'll open on your cue, ma'am." I looked at Vega and Porter. Both were ready. I could see it in their eyes. They weren't here for the flowers or the music. They were here because they'd been with me in places that didn't smell like polished wood and fresh paint. They'd seen me with a busted radio in a sandstorm, with a bleeding shipmate in my arms, with orders that didn't come with an instruction manual. The room on the other side of that door was full of those faces, men and women who'd trained until they collapsed, who'd ignored every instinct to run, who'd followed me into places where a mistake meant more than a bad performance review. And then there was Mom. I didn't know if she was out there, sitting in the back row, or still in her car. Knowing her, she could be standing just outside the building, close enough to prove a point, far enough to avoid being part of the event. I adjusted the cuffs one last time, felt the weight of the 4 stars on my shoulders, and thought about every moment that led here. The years in uniform, the long deployments, the injuries I'd stitched up on the fly, all the times I'd stood at attention for someone else. The petty officer glanced at me again. "Ready, Admiral?" I didn't answer right away. The air was thick, not with nerves, but with the sense that when those doors opened, there'd be no taking it back. The crowd would see me exactly as I was. No lace, no veil, no compromises. Vega leaned just close enough to speak without anyone else hearing. "Ma'am, it's your aisle. Let's walk it." I gave a small nod, the kind you give before moving forward into something you can't pause. The petty officer's hands went to the handles. I could feel the shift as the weight of the doors started to give. The noise from inside dropped another notch, like everyone was holding the same breath. I kept my eyes forward. Whatever came next, I wasn't walking in there alone. The doors hadn't even finished opening in my head before another memory pushed its way in me at 12 years old, sitting at our kitchen table while Mom polished her dress blues like they were made of glass. She didn't talk much when she was doing that. Every ribbon, every brass button had its place, and you didn't interrupt. Colonel Diane McKenna didn't need to raise her voice. She could kill a conversation with a look. The house was run on a schedule tighter than most bases. Breakfast was at 0600, dinner at 1800, and you didn't wander into the living room without shoes on. Even the family dog had a feeding chart taped to the fridge. Her version of affection was making sure my shoes were lined up at a 45-degree angle and that my bed was tight enough to bounce a coin. She never said, "I love you," but she always said safety first before I left for school. Our living room had what she called the display. A glass case with medals from her deployments, a folded flag, and framed photos from ceremonies. It was off limits. I wasn't allowed to touch it, not even to dust. She'd catch me looking and say, "Earn your own, then you can hold them." When I started talking about the Navy, she didn't laugh. She just shut down. "The Army keeps you grounded," she'd say. "The Navy will take you places you can't come back from." She wasn't wrong about the danger, but she was wrong if she thought I'd be scared off. I remember one Saturday when I was 15. We'd just finished raking leaves, and I told her I was thinking about applying for the Navy ROTC program at the University of Virginia. She didn't yell. She didn't argue. She just handed me a list of better options. Nursing, teaching, business admin, all safe, all boring. Her silence was worse than yelling. Weeks would go by with nothing more than the bare minimum of conversation. It was her way of saying she disapproved without wasting breath. My friends thought having a military mom meant pep talks and tough love. They didn't get the part where tough meant keeping your feelings in a locked drawer. Still, I learned things from her: how to stand straight without looking stiff, how to speak so people listened, how to show up early and be ready. I just decided to use those lessons in a different branch. When the Navy recruiter came to school during my junior year, I made sure to grab a brochure. Mom found it in my backpack that night. She didn't throw it away. She didn't have to. She set it on the counter and put her hand on top of it like she was pinning it down. "You don't know what you're asking for," she said. By the time senior year came around, I'd already filled out my NROTC application. I didn't tell her until after I'd submitted it. The day I got the acceptance letter, I stood in the kitchen holding the envelope, thinking maybe she'd at least nod. Instead, she kept reading the paper, didn't look up, and asked if I'd taken out the trash. It was like getting a medal and being told to sweep the floor. I took the letter upstairs, sat on my bed, and stared at it. I should have been excited. Instead, I felt like I'd just picked a fight I couldn't win, but there wasn't any going back. That night, I heard her on the phone with one of her old Army friends. She didn't use my name, just said, "She's making a mistake. She doesn't know what she's signing up for." I sat in the hallway, listening until the call ended, and then went back to my room and circled the start date on my calendar. If she wasn't going to back me, I'd go anyway. On the morning I left for orientation, my bag was packed, my paperwork in order. She was in the driveway, arms crossed, watching me load the car. I waited for some kind of goodbye, but all she said was, "You still have time to change your mind." I didn't. I got in, closed the door, and started the engine. In the rearview mirror, she was still standing there. The same posture she used at every formal inspection, straight back, chin high, eyes locked. That image stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because it was warm or supportive, but because it was the last thing I saw before driving toward the only life I wanted. The first morning at the University of Virginia's NROTC program started before the sun came up, which suited me fine. I'd been waking up at 0500 my whole life thanks to Mom's Army schedule. The difference was, here, nobody was telling me I was making a mistake, at least not yet. The acceptance into the program had landed with more of a thud than a celebration back home. The week after I told her, Mom didn't sit across from me at breakfast. She'd make her coffee, set the paper down on the counter, and leave before I came in. If I caught her in the kitchen, she'd find something to do in another room. That was her version of, "I'm not happy with your choices." 3 days before I had to report for officer candidate school at Newport, she slid a stack of papers across the dining table. I thought they were travel orders. They weren't. They were job applications, civilian jobs. Clerk positions, bank teller openings, even a part-time admin role at the local community center. You could still have benefits, insurance, stability, she said, tapping the stack like she was offering me a winning lottery ticket. I kept my hands on my coffee mug. "I already signed my papers. This is happening." Her jaw tightened. "It doesn't have to." We sat there in the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own breathing. She was hoping I'd cave. I was hoping she'd at least say she understood. Neither of us got what we wanted. When the day came to leave for Newport, I walked downstairs with my bag. She was at the kitchen sink, rinsing a coffee cup. No hug, no handshake, just, "Make sure you write when you can." It was the closest thing to approval I'd heard in months. The drive to the base was quiet. I'd packed my own duffel, double-checked every piece of paperwork, and memorized the route like I was planning an op. At the gate, I asked if she wanted to come in, see where I'd be. She shook her head. "I've been on enough bases. This one's yours." I climbed out, grabbed my bag, and walked toward the main building. Halfway there, I heard the car door shut and the sound of her engine starting. By the time I turned around, she was already pulling away. Newport wasn't a gentle introduction. We were yelled at before we'd even stepped off the bus. Haircuts, gear checks, uniform issue, it was a blur of orders and movement. But the part I remember most was the first time I stood in formation in my service khakis. My shirt was a little stiff, the creases too sharp, but it felt right. On Sundays, when we were allowed phone time, I'd call home. Sometimes she'd answer, sometimes she wouldn't. When she did, it was always short. "How's the weather? You eating enough?" "Never. I'm proud of you." But I kept calling. Old habits die hard. One afternoon in the mess hall, I got a letter from her. No return address, just my name in her blocky handwriting. Inside was a single page. "Stay safe. Don't take unnecessary risks." That was it. No signature. Not even, "Love, Mom." I folded it and stuck it in my locker. Graduation day at OCS was cold enough to see your breath. Families lined the bleachers, waving and cheering. I scanned the crowd between commands, hoping I'd spot her. I didn't. After the ceremony, some of the guys took pictures with their parents. I stood by myself near the edge of the field, waiting to see if maybe she'd surprise me. She didn't. One of the instructors offered to take my picture. I stood there in my dress whites, holding my cover under my arm, smiling like I meant it. Later, back in my room, I set the photo on my desk. It was just me against the backdrop of the parade field. No one else in the frame. Looking at it, I realized something that stuck with me. This wasn't about proving her wrong anymore. It was about proving to myself that I could carry the weight without her in my corner. The next set of orders came in a week later. Mayport, Florida. My first duty station. No one to send me off. No one to pick me up at the other end. Just me, my orders, and the start of the life I'd chosen. Mayport smelled like saltwater, diesel, and paint that never quite dried. My first posting was on a supply ship that spent more time tied to the pier than out at sea. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I'd barely checked into my rack when the senior petty officer in my division looked me over and said, "Another butter bar." Great. It wasn't mean, just the default Navy way of reminding you that shiny gold bars don't mean you know a damn thing. The days blurred into a loop of maintenance checks, inventory runs, and trying to learn 100 names without a single name tag in sight. I learned quickly that if you wanted the crew's respect, you showed up early, got your hands dirty, and didn't hide behind the rank on your collar. I wrote to Mom after my first week short, nothing emotional. Just told her where I was stationed and that I was settling in. No response. When the ship finally got underway for a training exercise, I discovered seasickness was a thing you could hide for about 45 minutes before it took you down. I spent the rest of the day on deck, breathing through my nose and trying not to embarrass myself. One of the chiefs noticed and handed me a ginger candy without a word. That tiny gesture felt bigger than anything I'd gotten from home in months. The first time we pulled into port after a week at sea, I tried calling her. Straight to voicemail. I left a message. 2 days later, I got a text. Busy. Hope you're safe. That was it. I kept the phone on me during duty shifts, just in case. Most of the time, the only people checking in were old academy friends and the occasional buddy from OCS. My mother's silence started to feel less like a phase and more like the new standard. One afternoon, I was overseeing a resupply operation when a crate slipped from the hoist and nearly crushed a crewman. My heart jumped into my throat, but we got him out of the way in time. That night, I sat in my rack thinking how easily that could have gone the other way. I almost called her just to hear a familiar voice. Almost. A few weeks later, I got my first set of evaluation reports. My division officer said I was adaptable under pressure, but still finding leadership footing. It was fair. You don't become a good officer by showing up, you earn it in the moments people aren't watching. The crew didn't warm up overnight, but little by little, they stopped testing me with the usual newbie tricks. I learned to coil lines properly, run a proper watch, and fix a busted pump without calling in 3 people to hold the flashlight. When my first Navy birthday came around 1 year in uniform, I sent Mom a short note. Still here, still safe. I don't know why I expected more than the 2-word reply. Good. Stay. How? Graduation from our advanced training phase was supposed to be a big deal. We'd completed a major certification exercise, the kind that earns the whole ship a weekend of liberty and a crew photo on the pier. Families were invited. I sent her the details anyway. She didn't respond. On the day, I stood in formation with the others, scanning the small crowd on the pier. Wives, husbands, kids waving homemade signs. I didn't see her. Didn't really expect to. After the ceremony, people broke off to hug their families, pose for pictures, and head out for celebratory dinners. I stayed behind, waiting until most of the crowd thinned out. One of the junior sailors offered to take a picture for me. I stood there in my uniform, cover under my arm, the pier behind me. The photo came out clean, crisp, and absolutely empty, except for me. That night, back in my rack, I set the printed copy in my locker. It wasn't the picture I wanted, but it was the one I had. And maybe that was the point. This was the life I'd chosen, with or without applause from home. The first time I heard the rattle of automatic gunfire over water, it was so far off it sounded like popcorn. By the time it got close enough to recognize, the adrenaline had already kicked in. It was 2009, and our ship was in the Gulf of Aden as part of an anti-piracy patrol. The heat was the kind that made the air feel heavy in your lungs, but nobody cared about that when the call came over the comms. Fast boat approaching, possible hostile intent. We drilled for this a dozen times, but drills don't make your hands sweat or your hearing sharpen to a point. The boat came in fast, low, narrow, packed with men who weren't there to trade postcards. I was topside when the first warning shots cracked the water. Most of the crew froze for half a second, just long enough to remember this wasn't the safety of a training exercise. I moved toward the bow, shouting orders to get non-essential personnel below and the 50-calorie team ready. One of the gunners, a kid barely old enough to rent a car, fumbled with his headset. I grabbed it, locked eyes with him, and told him to breathe. That steadied him enough to get his hands where they needed to be. The boat didn't slow, and neither did the gunfire. When one of our lookouts went down with a graze to the shoulder, I didn't think I moved. Hauled him behind cover, pressed a hand to the wound, and yelled for a corpsman. The blood was hot against my palm, and the noise was so loud it felt like my chest was vibrating. Minutes later, the hostile craft peeled away, deterred by the volume of fire and the realization we weren't about to let them anywhere near the hull. The smell of gunpowder and salt stuck in the back of my throat for hours. The corpsman patched up the lookout, and he was back on his feet the next day, grinning like nothing happened. "You didn't even flinch," he said. I told him the truth. I'd been too busy thinking about what needed doing to feel scared. Word got around fast. By the end of the week, someone had chalked, "She doesn't bleed fear" on my locker. I pretended to roll my eyes, but I kept it there. When we pulled into port weeks later, the crew did what crews do: hit the bars, burned through their liberty hours like they were on borrowed time. I got an email from one of the chiefs. A photo of his newborn daughter. He'd named her Marin. I stared at that email longer than I'd stared at anything in months. This wasn't family by blood, but it was family all the same. People who'd seen you in the worst moments and decided you were worth trusting with their lives. I sent Mom a short message about the incident, leaving out the part where bullets were involved. She didn't reply. The Navy had a way of making the world both huge and small at the same time. One minute you're in port swapping stories with sailors from the other side of the planet, the next you're getting orders that drop you into a place you didn't know existed. But the part that stuck was this. The people next to you mattered more than anything. A month after the Gulf incident, I was sitting in the mess with a few of the crew. We were swapping bad coffee for worse jokes when one of the guys asked if my mom was proud of me yet. I told him she probably thought I was wasting my life. Chief Vega, yes, the same one who'd later walk me into my wedding, leaned back in his chair and said, "Then she's never seen you work." That line stayed with me, not because it hurt, but because it was probably true. I stopped expecting her to show up. I stopped checking the pier during homecomings. I poured it all into the job, training harder, learning more, getting my quals faster than anyone thought I could. By the time our deployment wrapped, the crew didn't see me as the new officer anymore. I was just McKenna, the one who'd pull you out of trouble, cover your back, and keep the ship moving. When we tied up back in Mayport, there was no one waiting for me. But I didn't walk off the ship alone. My people were there, and in a way, they always would be. The first time I saw the Strait of Hormuz from the bridge, it looked deceptively calm, sunlight bouncing off the water, freighters moving slow and steady, the kind of day you'd think nothing could possibly go wrong. We were midway through a transit in 2012 when the lookout called out a contact, fast-moving, small, coming in from starboard. At first, it looked like another fishing skiff. Then it didn't. The radar confirmed erratic movements, the kind that make you pay attention. The CO gave the order to alter course, and I was already moving between the helm and the comms. The skiff kept shifting like it was trying to figure out our pattern. In a narrow stretch of water like this, there's not a lot of room for guessing. Then came the call from aft lookout, second contact, port side, same behavior, 2 boats now, both moving faster than they had any reason to. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The helm responded better to short, precise commands, so I gave them. 5 degrees to port. Steady. Hold. The bridge was tense enough to hear breathing over the hum of the consoles. The smaller craft started closing in, and the CO authorized warning shots. The first burst hit water just ahead of their bow, sending up a spray. One boat slowed. The other didn't. The temptation in moments like this is to overreact, push too far, too fast. I kept my tone even, eyes on both contacts, mind running through every possible outcome. The crew was watching me as much as they were the radar. If I looked rattled, it would spread. Our gunners tracked both targets, ready for a second volley. I had the helm hold position until the lead contact finally veered off. A long 30 seconds later, the second boat matched the move, both disappearing back toward the coastline. Only when they were well clear did I realize I'd been gripping the edge of the console hard enough to leave marks in my palm. I exhaled slow, unclenched my hand, and gave the all clear to secure from condition 1. The CO stepped over, voice low. "Good work, McKenna. You kept the bridge from losing its head." The compliment meant something, but what stuck more was the way the crew moved after that. They didn't second-guess me as much. Orders got followed faster. People started coming to me with problems before they went up the chain. A week later, I got an email from Mom. 4 words. "Why risk your life for this? No. I heard what happened. No. Are you okay?" Just that. I stared at the screen for a while before deleting it without replying. We stayed on station for another month. I spent that time drilling the crew harder damage control, casualty response, man overboard drills. If something happened again, I didn't want hesitation to be part of it. One evening, we ran a simulated fire scenario in the engine room. The temperature in there felt like it could peel skin, but everyone moved with purpose. When the last hose team reported fire out, one of the new guys turned to me, grinning through the sweat. "Ma'am, you don't even blink when it's chaos, do you?" I told him the truth. Chaos just feels slower when you've already decided what needs doing. By the time we rotated back to Mayport, I had a reputation I hadn't set out to build. Not the loud leader, not the one with the big speeches. Just steady, calm under fire. We hit port, and the crew scattered to families, bars, and long overdue sleep. I went back to my empty apartment, dropped my bag, and sat on the couch without turning on the lights. The quiet felt different now, less like loneliness, more like the price of the job. 2 days later, I got a call from a shipmate. He'd been out with some of the others when my name came up. Apparently, one of the chiefs said, "If McKenna's on the bridge, I'll sleep fine." That was better than any medal I'd ever seen. The orders to Little Creek landed in my inbox with no warning. 3 years at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center. It wasn't a glamorous deployment, but it was where careers were made or broken. If you could make things work here, people noticed. The first week, I walked the grinder in the early morning and saw the usual scene. Candidates dragging boats over their heads, sand caked into every seam of their camis, instructors barking until their voices went hoarse. What I didn't see in the reports were the number of guys limping through evolutions with untreated injuries or pushing past obvious exhaustion because they didn't want to be labeled weak. I'd been around enough operators to know the culture. Pain was a badge, rest was for someone else, but it was costing us good people. Too many were washing out for preventable reasons. Stress fractures, dehydration, torn ligaments. I started keeping my own notes, separate from the official logs. Every time someone went down, I wrote the circumstances: temperature, hours since last rest, type of evolution, water intake. Patterns started to jump out. One night, over coffee in the duty office, I pitched an idea to the senior medical officer. A daily readiness screening that wasn't just, "Are you hurt?" Something that forced a real check on hydration, nutrition, sleep, and early signs of injury. If they passed, they'd get a blue check mark on the roster. If not, they'd see medical before training. He laughed at first. "You know, half the instructors will hate it, right?" "Probably," I said. "But if we save even 5 guys from a career-ending injury, it's worth the paperwork." Getting it approved wasn't quick. I spent weeks pulling stats from other programs, making the case that fewer injuries meant better long-term retention and operational readiness. Eventually, the CO gave me the green light for a trial run. The first week of Blue Check was chaos: guys lying about their sleep, trying to chug water in the parking lot, instructors rolling their eyes. But by the end of the month, the data spoke for itself. Injury rates dropped 18%. Heat casualties dropped almost in half. The pushback didn't disappear, but it got quieter. Candidates started taking pride in getting their blue check each morning, like it was proof they were ready to work, not just survive. I sent Mom an email about it, not bragging, just explaining what we were doing. No reply. In year 2, the program expanded to every phase of training. We built it into the schedule so it didn't eat into evolution time. Instructors started using the data to tweak training loads. I saw fewer guys limping off the grinder and more making it through to graduation. At the annual training conference, I was asked to present the results. I kept it simple. Side-by-side charts, before and after. The room went quiet when I showed the difference in injury rates. Someone from another command asked if we could share the protocol. That was the moment I knew it wasn't just a pet project, it was going Navy-wide. After the briefing, one of the Master Chiefs clapped me on the shoulder. "You just changed the pipeline," he said. "Don't let anyone take credit for it but you." Back at Little Creek, the candidates kept earning their checks, and I kept my notes. I wasn't looking for recognition. I just wanted fewer names on the injury log. On the last day of my tour, a graduating SEAL candidate came up to me. "Ma'am, I was pulled on week 2 for a stress fracture," he said. "If they'd pushed me through, I'd have been done. Because of your check, I healed, came back, and now I'm here." That was the only award I needed. The email came through on a Tuesday afternoon while I was knee-deep in end-of-tour reports. Subject line: promotion approved, Rear Admiral, lower half. For a second, I just stared at it. The Navy had a way of moving you forward without fanfare. One day you're fighting to make a program work, the next you've got a star on your collar. I leaned back in my chair and let it sink in. Years of early mornings, missed holidays, deployments that blurred into each other, all of it had brought me here. Word spread fast. My XO walked in, grinning, and tossed a challenge coin on my desk. "Better start practicing your flag officer wave," he said. The official ceremony was scheduled for the following month in Norfolk. I didn't plan anything elaborate, just the necessary protocol, a few friends from past commands, and my current team. When the day came, the sun was sharp enough to glint off the brass railings. Standing at attention while they pinned the star felt heavier than I expected. The applause rolled over me, but my mind wandered straight to the empty space where my mother should have been. Later that night, back in my quarters, I found an envelope in my mailbox. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It's just a title. That was it. No congratulations, no acknowledgement of the work it took to get here, just a flat dismissal. I sat at my kitchen table with the letter in my hands, reading it again and again. The words weren't sharp, but they landed like a punch. She'd stripped the moment down to nothing. And part of me wondered if that had been the goal all along. I thought about tucking it into a drawer like I had with every other note she'd sent over the years. Instead, I stood, walked to the balcony, and pulled out my lighter. The paper curled almost instantly, edges turning black before the flame ate the center. I held it until the heat nipped at my fingers, then let the ashes scatter into the night air. The next morning, I put the star on my uniform and went to work like nothing happened. The crew treated me the same, maybe with a touch more deference, but I didn't feel different. If anything, the rank just meant more weight on my shoulders. Over the next weeks, I threw myself into the job. New responsibilities, new meetings, new faces to learn. I made a point of visiting every section under my command, talking to sailors where they worked, instead of pulling them into an office. At a staff meeting one afternoon, one of my captains asked if my family had been at the promotion. I told him no, kept my tone even, and moved on to the next agenda item. The truth was, I didn't need her there to validate the rank. I'd stopped needing that a long time ago. But burning that letter had been more than just getting rid of paper. It was a line in the sand. Whatever came next, I wasn't looking over my shoulder for her approval. That night, I pinned the star to its spot on my dress whites and left it there on the hanger, ready for whatever the Navy threw at me next. The first time I mentioned the wedding to my staff, they assumed I'd be taking leave for something small, maybe a courthouse, a quick dinner after. That was the Navy way. But Julian and I wanted something different. Old Point Chapel, white uniforms, the works. Julian wasn't military, but he understood the culture better than most civilians. We met through a mutual friend at a veterans fundraiser, and he'd seen enough deployments and homecomings to know how much the Navy shaped my life. He never tried to compete with it, just fit himself into the edges I had left. When we started planning, I told him I wanted to wear my dress whites instead of a traditional gown. He didn't even blink. Then that's what you'll wear, he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. The guest list was short people I'd actually served with, the kind who'd hauled gear in the rain with me, or stood watch at 0300 without complaint. I sent my mother an invitation out of obligation, not expectation. It was a simple card, no note inside, just the date and location. She didn't reply. Julian's family was easy Midwestern, warm, the kind who asked if you wanted seconds before you'd finished your first plate. Mine was a logistical footnote, one empty seat in the front row, reserved just in case she decided to show. As the date got closer, the Navy side of the guest list started to look like a unit reunion. SEALs, chiefs, junior officers. I'd mentored people from every stage of my career. They didn't RSVP with yes or no. They sent one-line confirmations like, wouldn't miss it or I'll be there in full dress. The night before the wedding, I laid my uniform out on the spare bed shoes polished, medals in order, covers spotless. I pressed every crease like it was an inspection. Julian came in, leaned on the doorframe, and smiled. You're ironing the life out of that jacket, he said. Force of habit, I told him, not looking up. He came over, slid his arms around me, and rested his chin on my shoulder. You know tomorrow isn't about them, right? Not your mother, not the Navy, just us. I nodded. But the truth was, it was never just us. Everything I was, everything that had brought me here was tied up in the people who'd stood beside me in the hardest places, and in the one person who'd never stood beside me at all. I didn't expect her to show, but I still made sure the seat was there. The morning of the wedding started quiet, too quiet for my taste. The chapel was only a short drive from the hotel, and the early light made the stained glass windows glow like they were lit from inside. I was in the small prep room at the back, uniform jacket hanging on a wooden hook, hair already pinned tight. My phone buzzed on the table. Unknown number. For half a second, I thought it might be a wrong call from one of the guests. Then I opened it. One word, in her handwriting-style text. Disgraceful. No name. No punctuation. No explanation. I didn't need one. My chest went tight, but the feeling was sharp, not crushing. I set the phone down face down and finished buttoning my jacket. Outside the door, I could hear the muffled shuffle of guests finding seats. The chapel smelled faintly of old wood polish and salt air drifting in from the bay. The coordinator poked her head in, whispering, "We're ready for you." The organ started, low and steady. I stepped into the hallway, my cover tucked under my arm, metals catching the light. The double doors at the front of the chapel swung open. And then it happened. From the front row to the back, every Navy uniform in the room snapped to attention. 200 men and women, SEALs, chiefs, officers, rose as one. The air filled with the sharp, unified sound of heels hitting wood. A voice rang out from somewhere near the aisle. "Admiral on deck." It wasn't planned. It wasn't scripted. It was instinct. The kind of thing you can't fake. The guests who weren't military looked around, startled, then quieted when they saw the discipline in the posture, the way the salute wasn't for show. I took the first step forward, the click of my shoes echoing through the space. My eyes caught familiar faces, Vega from the Gulf of Aden patrol, 2 of my blue-check graduates, even a corpsman I'd barely recognized out of fatigues. The salute held until I reached the front, where Julian was waiting. His smile was steady, but his eyes flicked over my shoulder like he knew the weight that moment carried. I turned to face the room and returned the salute, not rushed, not stiff, but deliberate. When I dropped my hand, the room settled back into its seats, the silence almost reverent. Somewhere in the back, near the exit, I thought I saw a familiar silhouette, arms crossed, back straight, chin high. But before I could be sure, the view shifted, and the officiant began to speak. Julian took my hand, and for the rest of the ceremony, I didn't look back. The reception was loud in all the right ways, laughter bouncing off the walls, clinking glasses, the occasional off-key Navy chorus from a table that had clearly found the open bar. Julian's nephews were darting between chairs, chased by a retired chief who'd somehow been roped into babysitting duty. I did the rounds, shaking hands, accepting hugs, listening to toasts that straddled the line between heartfelt and wildly inappropriate. Every so often, someone would mention the salute, their voice dipping like it had been some kind of sacred moment. It had been. Late in the evening, when most of the guests had moved to the dance floor, I stepped outside for a breath of air. The night was cool, the kind of coastal breeze that carried both salt and quiet. My phone buzzed in my pocket. This time, it wasn't a text, it was an image. No message, no caption, just a photo. It showed the outside of the chapel, shot from across the parking lot. In the foreground was my mother, standing perfectly still. Arms folded, back against the side of her car, eyes fixed somewhere just beyond the open chapel doors. She was in civilian clothes, hair pulled back, posture so straight you'd think she was still in uniform. Whoever took the picture had caught her mid-observation, not moving toward the building, not turning away, just watching. I stared at it for a long moment. The reception music thumped faintly through the closed doors behind me, but the photo made everything else feel muted. She'd come close enough to see, close enough to hear the organ, maybe even the salute, but not close enough to be part of it. I didn't reply to the sender, whoever it was. I slid the phone back into my pocket and went inside. Julian caught my eye as I returned to the table. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice low so the others wouldn't hear. "Yeah," I said. And in that moment, it was partly true. The rest of the night carried on in a blur of cake, speeches, and one truly regrettable dance-off between a SEAL and a supply officer. But under it all, the image stayed in my mind, my mother, outside the chapel, just far enough away to keep her distance, but close enough to prove she still cared enough to look. 2 months after the wedding, I was standing behind a podium at the Navy Operational Safety Conference, a room full of officers, chiefs, and civilian analysts staring back at me. The brief on my slides was simple. The salute standard, the evolved version of the Blue Check program, now implemented fleet-wide. I walked them through the numbers. Training-related injuries were down 32% across all commands using the system. Medical discharge rates during pipeline training had dropped sharply. Fewer lost workdays. Higher graduation rates. It wasn't flashy, and I didn't add dramatic music. I didn't need to. The data told the story. The kind of story the Navy actually listens to. When I wrapped up, the applause was steady but not showy. A couple of commands requested follow-up meetings. One Master Chief joked that I'd just cut his injury paperwork in half. I left the stage with a quiet satisfaction, the kind that doesn't spike your adrenaline but settles in your bones. Back in my office later that afternoon, my aide handed me a stack of mail. Most of it was standard Navy admin. Memos, commendation requests, the occasional thank you note from a command that had used the program. At the bottom was a plain white envelope. Handwritten. No return address. I knew the handwriting instantly. I closed my office door before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper. The first line stopped me cold. I need to see you. The rest was short, almost abrupt. Hampton National Cemetery. Sunday at 1,400. No uniform. Just you. Signed simply, Mom. I read it twice, then set it on my desk. For years I'd imagined what it would take to get her to reach out like this. A promotion? A headline-worthy act? Something so undeniable she'd have to acknowledge it? Instead, it came after she'd stood outside my wedding and left without a word. I didn't call. I didn't write back. I just let the letter sit there while I finished the day's work, went home, and stared at it on my kitchen counter like it might change if I gave it enough time. By Saturday night, the paper was still there, unchanged. But my mind wasn't. Sunday came with the kind of winter wind that cut through layers. I drove into Hampton with no music on, just the low hum of the tires against the road. The gates of the cemetery were open, the white headstones stretching in perfect rows like they'd been placed with a ruler. She was easy to spot standing near the center path, hands clasped behind her back, hair pulled tight, wearing a dark coat that made her look even taller. For a moment, I almost saw the colonel she used to be, not the woman who'd spent years refusing to show up. I walked over, stopping a few feet away. She didn't turn right away, just kept her eyes on the line of graves in front of her. I served with some of these men, she said finally. Her voice was steady, but quieter than I remembered. I glanced at the names. 2 were from my own tours. So did I said. We stood there in silence for a while, the kind that isn't awkward but isn't comfortable either. The wind moved through the bare trees, and somewhere off in the distance, a flag clinked against its pole. When she did face me, her eyes were sharper than I expected. I didn't come to your wedding because I didn't know how to walk in after everything I'd said to you, and when I got there, I stayed outside because I didn't think I'd earned the right to stand in that room. End of tear. I didn't rush to fill the space after her words. She took a breath, then straightened. Almost like instinct took over. And then she did something I'd never seen from her not once in my life. She raised her hand in a salute. It wasn't crisp, the angle was a little off, but it was hers. For a second, my body didn't move. Then I returned it, my arm locking into place. We held it for what felt like far longer than regulation, then dropped our hands at the same time. Neither of us said, I'm proud of you. Neither of us said, I'm sorry. But in that exchange, I think we both heard it anyway. She glanced back at the graves and asked, Still think the Navy was worth it? I didn't look away when I answered. Every damn day. We didn't hug. We didn't make plans for dinner. We just walked back toward the gate together, step for step, until the gravel turned into pavement, and the wind didn't seem quite as cold. 6 months later, I was back in Norfolk for the Navy's annual Training Safety Awards. The auditorium was packed rows of crisp uniforms, the sharp scent of fresh polish and starch hanging in the air. My program had been nominated for the Admiral Zumwalt Award for Excellence in Safety, and while I didn't say it out loud, I knew we had a shot. The MC read off the category, the nominees, then my name. I walked to the stage with the same steady pace I'd used in inspections, my shoes clicking against the polished floor. The applause was loud, but the kind of loud that feels earned. The award itself was a glass plaque shaped like a wave, heavier than it looked. I shook hands with the presenter, smiled for the photo, and was turning toward the stairs when something in the front row caught my eye. She was there. Not standing in the shadows, not outside a building, not halfway across a parking lot, she was right there, in the first row, in uniform. The ribbons on her chest were perfectly aligned, her posture was textbook, and she was on her feet. When our eyes met, she brought her hand up in a perfect salute. No hesitation, no angle off. The kind of salute you give when you mean every millimeter of it. I stopped halfway down the steps. The room went quieter than a room that size should be able to go. I returned the salute, slow and deliberate. And for the first time, I saw something in her expression I'd never seen before, pride without a filter. We dropped our hands at the same time. I finished walking down, took my seat, and let the rest of the ceremony run its course without looking over again. Afterward, in the mingling chaos of photos and handshakes, she made her way toward me. No crowd in between, no convenient distance to hide behind. "You did good," she said. Simple, not flowery. But from her, it was more than enough. I smiled, not big, not for show. "Took me long enough." She gave the smallest shake of her head. "Number. You were there all along. I just wasn't looking." We didn't linger. She had people to talk to, and so did I. But as I walked out into the evening air, a ward under my arm, I realized something. The sharpest revenge I'd ever gotten wasn't the salute in the chapel or the star on my collar. It was this standing tall enough, long enough, that the one person who had dismissed me had to stand at attention and acknowledge what I'd become. Blood doesn't salute. Honor does. Looking back, the moments that should have broken me ended up building me instead. Every deployment, every cold shoulder, every word meant to cut, none of it outweighed the weight of standing in that chapel, or in that auditorium, knowing I hadn't been to fit anyone else's idea of who I should be. I didn't choose the Navy to prove anything to my mother. I chose it because I knew who I was when I wore the uniform. The fact that it brought me to a place where she had no choice but to see it, that was just a bonus. In the end, the salute wasn't for me alone. It was for every person who's been told they're not enough, and kept going anyway.